Hello, America, and welcome to Teach the People. I am your host, Areshia McFarland. Our first guest is Mr. Jonathan Foy. Jonathan is the Executive Director of Educational Equity and Transformation for the New York City Department of Education, Office of Equity and Access. Jonathan dropped some nuggets on me that I can't wait to share with you. He's going to tell us where we've been, where we're going, and what we've got to do to get there. As we talk about education and race relations in America, I want you to pull out your pen and paper and take some notes. Welcome to Teach the People. So the first question that I'm really curious about, now I know a lot about what you do and the work that is going on in the New York City Department of Education. Can you share with everybody what your role is and what your office does in particular?
Sure. So I am the Executive Director for Educational Equity and Transformation for the Office of Equity and Access in New York City. And the Office of Equity and Access's mission is to eliminate long-standing disparities in our school system. Racial disparities, socioeconomic disparities. And when we talk about disparities, we're talking about the differences in student outcomes. We're talking about the differences in access and opportunity to programs and resources. So for example, there is a predictable pattern of students who are overrepresented in gifted and talented classes. There's a predictable pattern of who's overrepresented in suspensions and classroom removals. And our goal of our office is to look at those issues and to help districts and schools remedy those situations so we have more equitable outcomes for students. So that's what the office does, and that's the work that I help lead.
So your office primarily works with school leaders or district leaders?
Both. So we work with superintendents and their district equity team. And the goal there is to build the capacity of each district to lead for equity. Our goal is to actually work ourselves out of a job. When there's an issue around equity, we don't want them calling the Office of Equity and Access. We want them to be able to address it. So a large part of our job is to build the capacity of the districts, but we also work with school equity teams. So a principal will assemble a group of educators within the school based upon what their area of focus may be. It might be looking at disparities in special education classifications. It might be looking at disparities, as I mentioned before, in suspensions and discipline referrals. Whatever the issue is will determine who are the people that come to the table to help look at the issue within the school. So we work with district equity teams and superintendents. We work with principals.
Can you give me an example of what your work looks like in a school building? What are your touch points when you personally go into the school building or when your team members go into the group? Sure. What happens?
So first we provide the school with up-to-date data around patterns and trends. So we will give them data around students with special needs classifications by race, by socioeconomic status, by English language learner status, and we help them look at the trends in the data. We help them look at the relative risk ratio, meaning what's the likelihood of a student of this profile will have this type of outcome within your school. We look at risk index, what a percentage of a particular population is having a particular type of outcome. So for example, if we're looking at discipline data, and this is a sad reality in some of our schools, you might find that Black students are 10 times more likely than any other student in the school to be suspended out of school. So when we look at data like that, we want to make sure that those issues are addressed, because when you look at data, the outcomes should be proportional to the student population. So if Black students are 30% of a school population, they shouldn't be 60% of discipline referrals. If Latino students are 65% of the population, they shouldn't be 80% of special ed referrals. So when we look at those disproportionate numbers, those are the areas that we want to look much deeper into.
With all that's going on right now in the climate in America and all the conversation about race, what are your school leaders saying about it? How are they talking to their staff, to their students? I mean, what is the message out there? Because, it's young people are out on the front lines doing all the protesting. What is the DOE's response to that, or from your office? What is your all's take on what's happening these days with race relations in America?
For generations, race relations and conversations about race interracially have been taboo subjects. A huge part of our office and a huge part of my work in particular is to build the capacity of districts and schools to engage in these conversations. It's really important for all of us to have the skill, will, and capacity and knowledge of how to have these conversations. So we do a lot of work around coaching superintendents to find their voice around it, to really understand what their beliefs are about why these disparities exist, and to, again, build their capacity to lead through some of the discomfort that comes with these conversations. And I would, to be honest, I wish more of our leaders would lean into those conversations. Unfortunately, it's slower than I would like, but I do have optimism. There are districts that are, grappling with these difficult conversations, because before we can talk to the children about it, the adults have to be able to process it themselves. And so we spend a lot of time on that, and centering the data is a big part of it. So when the data shows that there are these racial issues, it's a good segue into the racial conversation for those that struggle with it, because the data is smacking us directly in our faces around racial disparities, as I said before, that are predictable. You can go anywhere in New York City or anywhere across the country, and you're going to see fairly predictable patterns of overrepresentation in certain areas and underrepresentation in other areas.
I hear you talking about conversations a lot. And a lot of times we hear the term crucial conversations or courageous conversations around race. What does that mean? What does that look like in real terms?
So, and we use the term courageous conversations. There's a whole protocol, Courageous Conversations About Race, that our office uses as like a foundational framework. And, courageous conversations are about engaging, sustaining, and deepening conversations so we understand the racial nuances of our society and of our interactions. And it involves us speaking our truth in terms of speaking about how we make meaning of what we see. It's about understanding the differing perspectives that come to the table and really trying to understand the experiences a person might have that leads them to a particular point of view. And then as we deepen the conversation, we have to really listen to each other and understand where our gaps of understanding are. We are, in my opinion, intentionally socialized to not know a lot about the racial history of our country. So some of these patterns that we see, we've seen them ever since we were born, so we think it's just supposed to be like this. But there are patterns and policies and practices that feed those numbers. And part of our work is to kind of go below the line, if you will. We see something in front of us that's like above the line, but below the line is about understanding what's the practice, policies, and beliefs and mindsets that keep these things in place. So the courageous conversation is about delving into those things. And for a lot, it's very uncomfortable because the way many of us have been socialized.
So can you give me an example of what you mean by that? Like maybe a misunderstanding that they may have had about how things have transpired historically?
Sure. Let's take the concept of colorblindness. Colorblindness is, a belief that, I don't see color. We're all the same. We're all one person. We're all part of one race.
Mm-hmm.
And for a lot of folks, particularly white folks, they've been socialized to believe that that's a healthy way to deal with racial issues by avoiding that there are racial differences. And many times in our work and the conversations we have, we get folks that may have been oriented with a colorblind, perspective to see the harm in it. Because the fact of the matter is, our society treats us differently by how we look. So if you don't
say it again one more time so the people can hear it. Say it one more time.
Our society treats us differently based upon how we look. And if you've been socialized to not notice those differences or really ignore them, then when they happen, you're going to be blind to them, and then you will be perpetuating harm for people. So to take people through a deep introspection and reflection about their colorblind socialization, that could be challenging to people. And it could make some feel as if, they've been doing the wrong thing this whole time. And, so there's certain guilt that comes with that. And we have to help people process that if they're going to lead and engage in work. If you're colorblind, how do you speak to issues of identity and curriculum? If you're colorblind, how do you speak to issues of oppression and marginalization and privilege if you don't understand the differences that exist in our society? So that's an example of a concept and a socialization that people have that we help people unpack. So instead of being colorblind, we want them to be color conscious. We want them to look at the differences in people's cultures and lived experiences and be able to analyze it, celebrate it where there's area for celebration, because it provides a richer, more empowering learning experience. So that's one example.
When you start thinking about people who say that they're colorblind, I don't see color, and suppose I'm that person and I see a stack of books that I need to read to understand, or I need to go watch this series of documentaries, or when the work looks so big in front of you and, you're just one person, what do you do?
You start with yourself. You start with unpacking your own socialization, and there are books and videos and a whole field of scholarship to get you started with you. You start with the personal, local, and immediate self.
The man in the mirror.
Say again?
Well, that's your Michael Jackson. You do your man in the mirror.
Yeah, there you go. You do your man in the mirror. And, based upon the context, there may be different steps that, I would recommend for someone in terms of what they want to read, whether there are people who need to build their equity literacy, their actual vocabulary, to understand the difference between racism and discrimination, or prejudice and discrimination, or privilege. These are terms that sometimes we throw around where there's not a common understanding of what these things mean. Some people might need more racial awareness to understand, the different phases of racial identity development and the actions or inactions that accompany some of those stages of identity development. There's a lot. There's so many places people could go.
Yeah.
But we like to customize our remedies and our development work based upon who we're working with.
That brings up a very interesting question. Is this the work that Black people should be doing? Like, if I'm a Black person who's kind of lived in a world where I didn't experience much discrimination, and I haven't had the day-to-day struggles, maybe I don't know who those people are, but maybe there's some folks out there. Is this the type of work that would be appropriate for Black people?
This is the type of work appropriate for every person that lives in this country. We live in a society that, based upon how it works, there's a lot of marginalization. There's a lot of biases that people have around each other. And we all have to inspect ourselves first And then, we don't want to do unintentional harm to anyone. And we have to be aware of how our actions and inactions can do that. So everyone needs to do this work. If you're a person of color, for example, if you're a Black person, you might have more racial awareness just because you're a Black person living in America. But it doesn't mean you have the skill to teach others or to help other people's ideals and ideas evolve. So there's a lot of work we all need to do based upon the roles we play in society to do that, to make our society a more just society.
I'm gonna take some notes.
Okay.
So if I need to get myself together, I need to look in the mirror. So the first thing, look at the man in the mirror. What are some steps that I can take as the everyday layperson, Black, white, Hispanic, Asian, whatever it is, to begin to do that initial work on myself?
Start with the question of, think about an early memory in which you first remembered or interacted with this concept of race. What happened? What meaning did you take from it? Then, what meaning do you take of that event now? And one of the things that we find generally is when we ask people to do an activity like that, go back and think about an early memory of race and what was the meaning that you took from it. The majority of the time, unfortunately, the stories are very negative.
I was just about to say.
There's a negative experience that someone may have, whether it happened directly to them. I was walking home and I got a rock thrown at me, or someone said you're pretty for a Black girl, or whatever, right? Because we associate race with negative experiences, that's part of why we don't want to talk about it, right? So we have to unpack the meanings that have come from various, experiences, because it impacts who we are and how we show up or how we don't show up. So that's a basic, first thing you can do. Just think, because usually when these things happen, they happen when we're young. We rarely go to our parent and say, hey, Mom, Dad, this happened to me. What did it mean? You will make sense of it yourself. You may go to your peer group who doesn't necessarily know much more than you in terms of experience, and you create your own meaning. You normalize what we call the social construction of race based upon your interactions. And you have to start with unpacking that, because it might tell you who you have a preference for, who you have an aversion against. It might tell you who you think might be naturally smarter. You might want a certain type of, doctor or accountant or whatever, based upon all these experiences that many times you don't take the time to unpack the meaning that you're drawing from things. Share a brief example. When I was growing up as a child, I was teased a lot because my lips were thick, my nose was wide, my hair was naughty, and I was teased by people who look like me. So
we do that,
right? So I received messages. So when you say my lips are big, big compared to who? When you say my nose is wide compared to who? Now, as a child, I'm not sophisticated enough to make meaning of it, but what I did was I developed an inferiority complex about how I looked, right?
Mm-hmm.
As I got older, I understood that the, beauty standard for our society is a certain phenotype. It's a certain aesthetic that's more white looking, narrow nose, thinner lips. A lot of folks have these experiences. It might be about a woman's hair or the texture of all these things have racial implications about how we see ourselves, how we feel about ourselves. So, and it impacts education, because you take who you are wherever you go. So if I'm a teacher, my issues and my biases and my tendencies, and it's going to impact who I call on, who I don't call on. All these things have racial manifestations to it. And that's part of the work. That's just one part of the work. Kind of, I feel like I might have rambled a little bit, but in terms of some of the things you can do first, the introspection happens first. And then we can kind of, before you go out and do the work, you have to do the work internally.
So I want to step off the, I know we're here to talk about education. I want to get to that, but I have a selfish question I want to ask.
Okay.
What do you do, or what advice do you give in many situations, as Black professionals, we'll find ourselves as the only in the room, right? Yeah. And you don't have perhaps a colleague or someone within your direct circle that might look like you. And I guess we've all heard the term code switching, right? So you have to wear the mask, basically. What type of work does someone in that environment, when you find yourself the only in the room, and you may not, you can't open up these conversations, not in a comfortable way with your colleagues, because it's more of them than there are than you. Is now the appropriate time to start pushing toward those conversations? Or, with me, I always say you got to measure your room, you got to evaluate your room. But what does the person who is the only do in the room? Like,
so I've been the only in a lot of rooms, and I can only speak for what I would do, because different environments and different contexts, you might have to move a little differently. But one, to answer your question, it's always the time to have the conversation because race is always on the table. So if there are some racial implications to whether an environment might be inclusive and welcoming to all, we have to address those things. We stand on the shoulders of people who showed up for us. That's why we're in the situation we're in. So even if you're the only, you have to draw from the strength of those that came before us, our ancestors, and you have to, have the conversations that need to be had. Now, one of the things that's important is to develop the skill to engage people where they are and, push them a little bit out of their comfort zone. We all have to be able to kind of operate somewhat out of our comfort zone, or else we don't grow. Mm-hmm. And hopefully you're in an environment that respects that. The challenge, though, is a lot of environments really value safe space over brave space. And safe space means there should be no disequilibrium, especially no racial disequilibrium. And if that is the case, you should challenge it. I've had situations where I felt, I've been fortunate to be on, cabinets of leaders and stuff like that. And there have been times where issues have come up, and whether, let's say, someone says something that's concerning, I've seen leaders gloss over it because they don't want to rock the boat. And whether you in the moment speak up and say, well, I think we need to address what someone just said, or whether afterwards you go up to someone, your leader, and say, hey, can I talk to you about what happened in the meeting? And say, can you share with me why you felt we shouldn't discuss what was said? That's part of being courageous, right? So you might say, I think it was a missed leadership opportunity. And you could get into a conversation. Obviously, you have to build rapport and relationship to do those things, Sure. But that's part of our job. We have to be in community with the people we work with, within equity work for sure. Mm-hmm. So you have to be courageous. You have to lean in, and ultimately you have to decide. I have to decide any space that I'm in. If I feel like we're not authentically living our mission, I have to decide if that's a place for me.
There's a term that's being thrown all over the place that I would like a clear understanding of what it means. What is implicit bias?
Implicit bias are the unconscious thoughts, beliefs, attitudes that we have about people, things, and places. The implicit bias work that we do, we focus on the implicit bias between people because we're in the people business. And
I like that.
and our unconscious biases, whether it's a preference for or an aversion against someone, it can impact our work in a lot of ways. So we do implicit bias awareness workshops for for all the staff in the districts that we work with. So they can really reflect on how they make meaning of the world and how it might impact their work.
What does implicit bias, though, look like in schools?
Sure. It can look a lot of ways. Implicit bias can impact who you think has more ability than someone else. It could impact who you call on and who you don't call on. It can impact who you think might be threatening and who you think might not be threatening. It could impact who gets the easier question, who gets the more difficult question. It can impact policy. It can impact practices. It impacts everything. So we have to be able to be aware of it in order to mitigate it. And I say mitigate it, not eliminate it, because our brains are wired to take shortcuts and to make meaning quickly. If we had to stop and reflect on every single thing we came into contact with, we wouldn't be able to live our lives efficiently. So our brain does make shortcuts. And sometimes implicit bias is good. It might get you out of harm. You might see danger based upon previous experiences and say, hey, that's a dangerous situation. That's you're making meaning of things. But we also have to be aware of when it's harmful. And that's what our implicit bias awareness workshops take a look at. And we use a lot of studies from different universities around how implicit bias functions in everything from early childhood to, high school. And we help them look at strategies that will reduce your bias.
Now, in my work, I hear a term that comes across all the time that I would love a clear understanding of. I know what I think it means, but I'd like to hear it from the experts. What is culturally relevant curriculum?
Culturally relevant curriculum is curriculum that honors the cultural, ethnic, racial experiences of all of its students. It's an educational environment and approach that acknowledges the strengths and assets of our students and doesn't center the deficiencies that might exist. It helps students understand who they are and how they fit into the world. And it takes prior knowledge of students and helps and leverages it for a more empowering learning environment. So, there are a host of, different definitions from scholars, but all of them speak to the issues that I just talked about using the cultural references, understanding the cultural idioms of the, community that you are serving, whether it's a very diverse community and you need to know all the varying, cultures that live there, or whether it's somewhat monolithic culture where it's just whether it's just African American students or whether it's white students or whether it's whatever, you need to understand the community and the culture that you're serving, and you need to design the instruction where their culture is affirmed.
Their culture is affirmed.
Absolutely.
I like that.
Yes.
It seems like a lot of work. If I'm a teacher and I'm focused on the standards and making sure you're prepared, for the next grade level, I've got all this content that I have to deal with, and then you pile on it the whole social, racial complications of what's going on in the world. I mean, I don't really have time to go back and learn all this stuff. Like, what is the teacher to do in this day and age?
Well, to me, it's not about going back and learning all this stuff. It's about doing an audit of your current curriculum and looking at the touch points where particular themes can be maybe highlighted more. Um, you know, you take a theme of identity, right? How are students learning more about who they are? There's a lot of access points in curriculum to do that. So you don't have to recreate your curriculum, but if you do an audit, you may look at where is a where's a place where we can tweak some things so students are learning more about what it means to be a male or a female or black or white or a brother or a sister or a daughter. There's ways to like center the student and who they are into the curriculum. It's not about tearing it all down. It's about enhancing it. So, people who aren't necessarily proficient in the concept, they do think I have to like do something totally different. Take what we're doing and how can we infuse themes of identity and criticality, which is understanding how power, privilege, and oppression play. Uh, a middle school teacher recently did a remote learning, assignment using the work of Walt Whitman and Langston Hughes, two staples in curriculum, and they, through the poems that he selected, and I don't remember the poems he selected, but the question was, are things better today racially than, years past? And there were themes in the poem that connected to that question. And and we're talking about a 7th grade class. Mm-hmm. So the students actually felt like things weren't better. And the teacher, who was a white Jewish man, he said, as a white man, he racialized himself and he shared his perspective. Another thing about culturally, responsive and sustaining education is it also increases student engagement because young people see the world out there. And if we're not going to address the things that they see and navigate, that's part of why young people detach, because it doesn't seem real. It doesn't seem relevant to them. We are just deeply in denial. I mean, we're just talking about taking the Confederate flag off of places. There's actually an argument that the Confederate flag does not represent racism. And
what does it represent? The Dukes of Hazzard? I mean,
but that's actually great. But that's actually a good example because it shows you how ingrained these Black people's inhumanity is a foundational ideal in our country from the very inception. And in order for our country to work in the way that it's worked, we had to believe that. You take an example about how we're socialized. Look at a show, and this is a show I watched growing up and loved the show, The Dukes of Hazzard. The Dukes of Hazzard was a show that glorified the concept of who General Lee was.
Yeah.
Every show, the General Lee flew over, did this big jump to save the day.
With the Confederate flag on the top. It was on the top of the car.
With the Confederate flag on the top to glorify someone that fought against American ideals. And part of why our society does that is because society doesn't value Black people. And that's a hard thing to say.
Yeah, it's a hard thing to hear too.
And as Black people, we were so socialized. A couple of years ago, I actually asked my mother about, I said, hey, Ma, I used to watch The Dukes of Hazzard, right? Like, I said, did you ever think about like what it was about? And she never thought about it because we're socialized into our own inferiority.
Yeah.
And that's been one of the things that, our community has and still grapples with. But a show like that will help us develop our preferences and biases for things. We have, right now there's a big thing about the name of the football team in Washington.
Oh yeah.
Right?
Oh yeah.
For a very long time, people have called to change the name of the name of the team, and the answer always is they find a Native American group who will say we don't have a problem with it. And it's interesting of that strategy. You find someone who's okay with their inferiority, and you put them on center stage so you can justify it. Mm. That's how hard we want to stay with the beliefs and values that have been indoctrinated in us for over generations. We know the N-word, right? Like, so there's certain people of color who are fine with being called the N-word. You wouldn't put them out and say, well, they're okay with it, so we're going to name our team whatever.
Oh, Jesus.
Like, you, right? It's a derogatory term, but we don't value lives of Native Americans, so it doesn't matter. And it's just, those are hard truths, and you can easily say, and that's the difference between being anti-racist and not racist, because the owner of the Redskins could say, I'm not racist, and keep the name of his team that is derogatory. But if you're anti-racist, you've changed the name. You'll actually do something actively to...
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Right? Mm-hmm. But it's easy. I'm not racist doesn't involve any action.
No action.
It's just a term to deflect from the harm or the microaggression or whatever it is that you're doing. There are people that are telling you that this is offensive, and because it's not offensive to you, and you have the power, and you have the power, right?
That's right.
And that's, that's a pattern of our country.
So stop right there.
Yes.
What happens when you have one bad apple? It spoils the whole bunch, right?
That's the phrase.
That's the phrase. So if you got one bad apple that can spoil the whole bunch, what do you imagine a few bad apples can do? So right here, you know that there's something wrong going on, even if you think it's just in a pocket, but you know the difference between right and wrong. So you can't look at it and say, it's just a little bit wrong.
But here's the issue, or here's one of the issues. And this is why I'm not as optimistic about change, because how you diagnose this issue is going to impact how you address it. So if I feel that it is a few bad apples, then I don't have to look at the policies and the practices. I just could say, well, if I get rid of this person, the problem will be solved. If you understand that there are systemic issues in multiple places within the police force, from training, from hiring, from firing, from review boards, all those things are problematic. So, the gentleman who was in the interview, for him to say it's a few bad apples, and assuming that that's his authentic belief, then he'll just say, let's fire that guy, and they won't change the culture, right? And then they'll train another person who will embody the culture. So, culture eats policy for breakfast.
Culture eats policy for breakfast.
You could have any policy you want. You could say, we have a new policy where, you have to respect all of the community you serve. If the culture doesn't
reflect that,
buy that, you'll have it on paper, but the lived experience will be different. Mm-hmm. So, but, one of the things I see a lot, and, when you're trying to shift beliefs, it requires a much more personal experience. And there are a lot of work cultures that it's not expected that you have to get personal and share like how you were socialized and what you believe. Some people just want to come to work to do their job. And they don't subscribe to the idea that I bring myself to my job. They think they like come to the door, they are no longer themselves, and they just do a function.
They
And
code
again,
switch.
yeah. And that's, from my perspective, that's not what happens. Mm-hmm. We bring our biases with us wherever we go. So we have to be willing to unpack them. You know, in some of our sessions, we have people that are very honest. I'll have people say, you know what, I was raised to not like Black people, or to not think, you know, Black people are as good as someone else. Like, people say that from time to time. And I appreciate it because it's honest. And then we can have a deeper conversation about what were the messages that you had in your life that shared that taught you that. And sometimes they're very explicit things that they're told. Other times they're very implicit things that they picked up. And that type of transparency is how we can get to evolving and, you know, interrupting some of our own socialization. And what we have to be willing to do, and it's hard for some people, we have to be willing to admit that some of our socialization has been unhealthy. So as a man, there were many things that I was socialized in a very healthy way. And there were things I was socialized in an unhealthy way as it relates to women. So as a man, I was socialized and raised to objectify women. From the music videos I watched, from the songs I listened to the conversations guys have. If I don't acknowledge that that's a reality for me, I will perpetuate it way more than if I actually acknowledge that, yeah, like, I don't always show up the way I need to. And how do I actually interrupt that? Because I need to think about my mother. I need to think about, who are the women that I care for, that if someone did that, I have an issue with? How do I put the mirror to myself and look about when I show up and when I don't show up in terms of affirming women? So I can do that as a man. Wherever any of us have some privilege, that's where we have to look to see how do we show up for people who don't have that privilege. So as a man, there's certain privilege, in particular to women. As an able-bodied person, I have privilege. As, you know, people have to think about those identities that they don't think about a lot. That's where your privilege is. I rarely walk around thinking about I'm able-bodied because I don't have to think about that. I don't have a problem entering any place, right? So the identities that you have that you don't think about, that's where your privilege generally is. Mm-hmm. So a lot of white people don't have to think about being white in a lot of circumstances. That's a privilege. Doesn't mean you don't have hardship. Doesn't mean it doesn't mean for every circumstance that's the situation, but people's inability to acknowledge that there are some things we have to unlearn. There's some things we have to replace. When I was growing up in a homophobic society, I would say, oh, that's gay, when I was a teenager. At some point, I had to have a conversation with myself and to say, what am I really saying? Mm-hmm. So we have to be willing to do that to ourselves in multiple aspects of our life. I just named all these different areas I've done it for myself. But when it comes to race, we struggle to do that. I've had to check myself on my beliefs around how I raise my children or discipline them. The introspection is how we change and shift beliefs. And leaders have to be able to create the environments where that's normed. You can't just one day say, we're going to talk about race today. You have to build up to these things, right? And that's part of what leadership does. That's part of what we coach people to do.
Right. So that leads me to two things. And I think I asked you about this before, and you being a social studies teacher, that really triggers it. My father was a social studies teacher, and I was a history major, you're a history major. I have always been very curious, and I've always wanted to know, why is it that when we talk about Black history, it always starts with slavery, right? Why aren't we reaching back to what happened before we were, as I say, kidnapped and brought to this country? Why don't you think, because I would think that if that sort of information were shared, it would build the self-esteem of Black people to know where they came from, and the rich educations that were already in place in their homelands. Like, why not start our education process there? Like, even here in America, we learn all about ancient history from a European perspective. Why aren't we learning about it from an African perspective?
Because it would serve Black people well to do that.
Yes.
But from a national perspective and a state perspective, we don't create the curriculum. We're not in the rooms of who's creating it. We still have textbooks that talk about Africans were brought to the Americas to work.
To be workers, yeah.
Like there are textbooks that say that. So unfortunately, based upon the generations of, racist policies and practices, there are not a lot of racially conscious people in the rooms that make these decisions. That's why you see, we've all seen marketing ads that were racially insensitive, and people say, well, who was in the room? Not us.
Right.
Or even sometimes it is us, but we've all been miseducated around race. So just because you're a person of color doesn't mean you would be racially literate. You have to do the work.
Right.
So there are not a lot of people and decision makers who make the decision about where our curriculum starts. Mm-hmm. And yes, it would serve everyone well to understand the story before slavery, but it would also indict America, right? And it would create more racial disequilibrium for white people. And white people are socialized to not have racial stress. Mm-hmm. And colorblind is a good strategy for that.
What would you say if for somebody who wants to go out and read and learn, and what's the first piece of text that they can go to get their start? Like, if you say, you know what, I want to be conscious of what's going on racially, where do we begin?
It really depends. I mean, there are a lot of books that, if you want to understand, we've been talking about on this, conversation, we've been talking about some of the deeper issues of why our society has these predictable patterns. Mm-hmm. If you really wanted to understand that, there's a book called White Rage by Carol Anderson. And that book would really take the blinders off. Whether you're just starting your racial journey or whether you feel you know something, this book will give you things you don't know. And it's very well resourced. And it talks about the policies and the practices of our Supreme Court, of governors and mayors and presidents, from, Reconstruction to now. Mm-hmm. So that's one book that would help you understand how intentional this has been. Books around developing kind of your own racial equity or racial literacy, I should say. There's a book called What Does It Mean to Be White? Developing White Racial Literacy by Robin DiAngelo. I think that is a great book. And even though it's written by a white woman and she's kind of writing to white people, it's not a book just for white people. Anyone should read that book because it helps you understand the concept of whiteness. It helps you understand how people navigate it, and it helps you understand why a lot of white people are blind to some of the things that we're talking about. So that's a really good book. Another book that's really good, Race Talk and the Conspiracy of Silence by Daryl Wing Su, who is an Asian scholar who does a lot of work around microaggressions and race. And he talks about the nuances of why we don't have the conversation and why people will be silent, which kind of stops the conversation. He also gives strategies and recommendations for how you can push through that. So those are some of the books that I would recommend.
All right. So before we close out, I want you to give us some takeaways. What are some things that viewers can think about, can listen to, or really begin their work on themselves?
So, a few things you can do to reduce the biases that you have and we all have. There are a couple of strategies that we go over in our implicit bias awareness workshop that I think, and they're very practical things. We do a lot of them without thinking about it, but the idea is to be more intentional about when we do it. Okay. So one is called individuation. Individuation. When you individuate, what you're doing is you are asking questions of a person to get to know them more individually behind what it is you see. So, you take a group of people, let's say athletes. Sometimes athletes, there are these associations that we have with athletes, that they're not intellectuals, or they're getting a free ride based upon being an athlete. They're not working as hard academically. Those are all kinds of biases we can associate on an athlete without knowing, right? But individuating would be about asking them questions to better understand who they are. And it would get you past the assumptions that we automatically are going to make. I had a conversation with a teacher who was talking about a student who was claiming that the class was boring. And what the teacher basically was sharing this story to say how disinterested the student is. What an amazing opportunity to individuate that, to more deeply understand what's behind the fact that the student's bored, or what would make, but the teacher didn't do that. Because we decide who we want to individuate with. And part of what you got to do is lean in to figure out, well, who's the person I'm not individuating with? And I understand if you feel offended the kid says your lesson's boring, you might not want to do that. But as the adult, that's where you lean in. So individuating is something we can do very easily. Another thing, another strategy that we should think about is perspective taking. Perspective taking is really being willing to engage with someone to understand a different perspective than yours. Many times when we're in conversations, if someone has a belief or a perspective that's different than ours, sometimes our go-to is to already think about our response before we're even listening to them. Because we're socialized in many ways, especially if you look at the news cycle, whether you watch CNN or Fox, the whole format is I'm gonna talk over you and I'm gonna tell you that your point is not as good as my point. What we have to do is interrupt that. And when someone, let's use the colorblindness example. So I'm not colorblind. If I'm talking to someone that is colorblind, am I interested enough to know about what are the experiences that led them to be colorblind? Or do I just want to tell them they shouldn't be colorblind? Perspective taking is about taking the time to understand what are the experiences that led this person to this belief or this action, so I can better understand it. And the better I understand it, I might be able to actually offer them something to help them maybe evolve in a particular area, or vice versa. But if you don't perspective take, if you just want to demean a perspective, that's not what perspective taking is about. It's about really engaging in a sincere way, right? So that's another thing we can do.
To understand. Seek first to understand.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. I'll share one more. slowing down is something we can do. That's very basic. The way our brains work, and there's a lot of brain science behind this. I'm not going to get into the brain science, but our brains make automatic assumptions around things. I just gave the example of athletes, right? There's certain beliefs people are going to have, and certain associations. Athletes are entitled. They're this, they're that, right? When we're interacting with people, we have to sometimes slow down and consider what biases we're bringing into a situation and how it's impacting. In schools, we think about that a lot in terms of making sure that there are policies and practices where snap decisions aren't made. So students aren't just grouped in this particular category because the last couple students who look like this had this issue, so I'm gonna put them here, right? How do we have policies that allow us to slow down and look at the decisions we're making? So those are just some basic things we can do to reduce our bias. And that's even before you read anything.
Well, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to sit with us and share this wealth of knowledge. The whole goal of Teach the People is to share what I learned, and I've learned a lot today. I appreciate it. There are some things that you taught me about myself. I'll be taking a look at myself in the mirror and looking to see how I can implement some of the strategies that you've shared with us. I know that you are very busy, and I thank you for taking out this time. I thank your wife and your sons for sharing you with us today. I want to let you have the last word with the people, and you feel free to share whatever you'd like to allow to be your last words, but I just want to say thank you.
You're very welcome, and thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed my time, and I hope people found it to be helpful. I would say this. I would say that it's important that we put in the work so we can be the best version of ourselves. And our country has in its founding documents a promise that all of our citizens would truly have equal access. And the fact that we haven't realized that promise yet is not a disloyal statement to our country. It's a statement of love so we can have our country be what it says it wants to be. I want us to know that we can critique our society. We can critique our police department without being disloyal to it. We want us and our institutions to be the best version of themselves. And if anyone is being harmed, that should be a concern to everyone. So my hope is that people can marinate on that idea and start with some of the very basic things to make sure that in their own sphere of influence, they can make sure that they are seeing the humanity in every person and that they can just be helpful and valuable or add value to the lives of the people that they have or the people that they come into contact with. So it's not easy work, but it is the work. And I just want to again thank you for having me today.
We the people thank you, Jonathan Foy.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jonathan Foy, for a dynamic interview. Thank you, Mr. Overstreet, for some dynamic editing. And thank you for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe down below and come back next week for another episode of Teach the People. Remember, each one, teach one.